We are students of the art of play,
And we do this show called The Art of Play.
a show for the players who ask why.
I'm Vi.
And I'm Gaia.
Hey Gaia, what are we talking about today? And look to my right, we again have Taya in the studio.
Yeah,
So what's
Taya
going on
is
here?
back.
Yeah.
Back from our Morality Games episode. Taya is here, having provided all the notes for this one, too.
Little peek behind the curtain. Same day as last week. Still in the
same
studio.
hour.
Didn't leave. Still kind of nice outside.
Pay no mind to the Teo behind the curtain.
So,
Actually, the Taya behind the curtain gave you your honorary PhD.
That's the essence of the honorary PhD is
Yeah.
just a curtain.
based. So, today, we're going to be talking about horror games and how to do horror or scaring your audience, your players, right. Now, I know this is a bit of a difficult topic. Right before we started recording, Vi has openly admitted, not a fan of horror.
Oh yeah, no. Horror and me, not besties.
And Taya and I, when it comes to horror, both get freaked out for days afterwards, which is great.
What a good topic we've chosen. Everybody in this studio is like,
Well, it turns out Taya and I both had a pretty extensive horror phase in terms of like YouTube watching of games and analyzing games from that perspective. It's a bit of a different thing because you're watching through someone else's lens, but it still is this, all right, let's explore horror from some other perspective. And we've both done quite a bit of that, and that's going to be inspiring today's episode.
for context, I don't like horror at all. Not in films, TV, media. As a kid, I didn't even like Halloween. Like,
Vi, you signed on to my horror-themed D&D game.
ooh, we may need to talk about that.
Our Thursday game is horror.
I forgot about that. I just wanted to play.
I mean, it's not going to be too much
I mean, I don't
horror.
imagine D&D horror is a little different. But
Yeah. Okay, cool. So today we're going to be talking about horror games. So I like to give an organization of the episode usually at the beginning, so doing that again. We're going to be starting off with a discussion on, okay, well, what is horror in video games? What are the various types of horror? Why should we care about horror as a concept? And then we're going to be following a very similar layout to the previous episode of how do you do it wrong, and then how do you do it right? Now, there's a good question to be asked on why are we starting with how to do it wrong? And I think it's actually important for us to start there because it's a really good question. Like, we've often said, and I said this in a previous episode as well, that how do you do something wrong? Don't do it right. How do you do it right? Well, here's their 10-step program, right? But when it comes to horror, much like with morality systems, there's a lot of ways to actively harm a horror experience. Horror is a system that is so intrinsically built on immersion, something we're going to get into as we go, that it's so easy to just ruin it.
It's very delicate like a curtain. If a wind blows and you see the spooks behind it, your immersion is ruined.
Yeah, it's the theater suspension of disbelief thing. You have to be very in it to understand and enjoy it.
Yeah, so we're going to be really talking about early on, okay, what makes a horror game bad? And I think that's important because if you don't watch this whole episode, knowing how to identify when something did it wrong is, in my mind, a little bit more beneficial. How do you know when something did it right? You're scared. How do you know when something did it wrong? You're not scared. But why is it wrong? I think that's a harder question to answer, so I think that's going to be more interesting. So if you don't make it to the end of the episode, that's the fun bit. So I kind of want to launch in. What are the types of horror? Hey, Taya, you did the research.
Hi.
You have the notes. I copied yours. Hey, what kind of horror is there?
It's almost like somebody's copying my homework for this episode. I feel like I'm
Well, when we have a PhD in the room, it's just easy.
honorary. Important footnote.
Important footnote, did no work.
No, it did work, just not didn't write her own research paper. Part of research paper.
Quick 60-second bit, Dr. Fazio's how-tos for what's a horror game.
Dr. Fazio.
But yeah, I think when I think of
Dr. Fazio's guidelines for good horror.
you know what, that would be a great D&D module.
That's
just
fun.
saying.
I like it. Gaia, I don't know what your plans are from Thursday, but I think we should change them fundamentally.
The true development of quality horror is just consultation with Dr. Fazio. So,
Consultation
Is
with
it-
doctors, the true horror.
That's literally the whole bit for my SCP show that I'm running this summer. That's
man.
literally the bit. Consultation with Dr. Robin.
the medical systems in Canada do be terrifying.
True.
do be horrifying.
So, Taya,
But
what
yes,
kinds of horror are there?
when I think of horror games, beyond the fears of doctors. They
Some people validly afraid of doctors. I get it.
doctors actually fall into one of the three, maybe all of the three categories that I group them for. The first kind of default I think of is like not really horror games, but like more like using horror as a narrative piece or like as a piece of the story, but like fundamentally the way you interact with the game isn't horror. So that's kind of like shooter games, like even the Call of Duty Zombies mode.
Call of Duty Zombies,
right?
yeah.
Like it has horror themes, but it's not that like push and pull tension horror game feeling. So that's the first category.
Yeah,
I
like
would
Binding
piece
of
them.
Isaac as well, I feel falls into that.
Yeah, it uses pieces of horror for different narrative things, but it's not like fundamentally the goal of the game.
Yeah, it's the games that Vi can play.
Yeah.
Hey.
A room full of cowards discussing horror. This is going to go great.
But whoa, hang on. Characterizing me as a coward is bold.
Yes.
I'm characterizing all of us as cowards, so I feel like I'm being...
Vi, you and I were
delighted
chatting
here.
last night.
You know?
So what other kinds of horror are
Anyway, the second piece is jump scare horror, and I think that's kind of just like a baseline form of horror. A lot of the very first horror games that ever came out, like 3D Monster Maze, which is like arguably the very first horror game ever.
Pretty easy to make a game where it's like lull you into a sense of thing and then something scary jumps out
Right?
at
Even
you.
like horror in media, like a lot of horror movies and things are just kind of that.
You can
right?
build a good haunted house in a garage and just rely on this trope.
Yeah,
that's all you
but
need.
there's lots of
Yeah.
good games in here as well, though.
Oh, yeah.
Especially like
Yeah, well, it's
this
a-
is the whole theme of Five Nights at Freddy's, for example.
It's a category, and it can be done well, and it can be done poorly.
Yeah.
It's just a category.
And
Yeah,
other
it's just
I do have a
just
lot
like-
of examples I want to list out for this. Like, there's games like Amnesia, which we'll be talking about a bit later. Doki Doki Literature Club, I personally think falls into this category, as well as the next one. Some indie games I played and really enjoyed, like Mad Father, personally. It relies on this creepy environment, but the jump scares are the horror part.
Yeah, kind of like the intentionality of the horror there is the spook moments.
Getting
right?
to the jump scare.
And then the third category I would say is more the like psychological. Like that's posing questions about like reflecting your own inner feelings or just like kind of the environmental setting of spooky psychological. Like I've played a lot of Call of Cthulhu, like it very much has that like heavyweight psychological feeling. Doki Doki has pieces of this with the jump scares as well.
Yeah, I have some notes on this as well. Like, these are games that use the uncanny, the uncomfortable, the taboo, and the weird to inspire horror. Taken directly from the Wikipedia, they inspire suspicion, distrust, self-doubt, and paranoia. This is especially true for games like Doki Doki Literature Club, but also PT is a really good example of that. And they sometimes play on the user's mental state to make them question their own sanity or their understanding of the game world itself.
Game that
right?
make you uncomfy.
Yeah, like this is a really good example of this was Omori, a game that I've been so excited to talk about in this episode. Omori being a game that is very pastel, happy, friendly in the dream world, but then when you get transported to the real world, it's dark, it's evil, it's haunted, you're under attack, like, and the thing attacking you in that game is your own PTSD. Right? Very, very good game for psychological horror, and this massive tonal shift from this hours upon hours of friendly gameplay into, oh, the real world wants you dead. No, but not actually dead. It's your own brain, right? That tonal shift creates that psychological horror, like this sudden, massive change, questioning everything you know about the world is huge for Omori. And yeah, that gives us our three main types of horror. So here's kind of a question I want to pose. I'm going to pose this broadly, but I think Taya might have more to say in this one. What are some of your favorite horror games and why? Or games that use horror?
Well, now I'm throwing this over to Taya because my answer is nil.
None?
There are no horror games that I have ever enjoyed.
Are there any games you've enjoyed that use horror? Because Legend of
No.
Zelda does at times.
I was gonna say the Zelda series.
Not
Is
not-
that the part of the games you don't like when you have to go through the
Yeah.
creepy dungeon? Okay.
Yeah,
good.
that's the thing is like I don't like I'm playing Tears of the Kingdom right now. The depths, I don't like it. It's bad.
Evil.
Don't like being jump scared.
Welcome to Evil Week 5.
I don't like. Well, Evil Week is fun. It's a good time. Taya, please take it away because I have nothing to contribute.
Oh my
So what are some good horror games, Taya?
Yeah.
I have like a very surprisingly very long list of horror games that I've enjoyed, and they fall within like
Oh,
different
so
pieces
many.
of
I've
the
seen
category.
you've talked to me
Within
about
the
this.
first 10 minutes of me making my note sheet, I was like, oh my goodness, I've interacted with so many horror games.
It's almost like it's your favorite
Like
genre.
going through your Steam library, like that's also horror.
Yeah,
You know,
like, so
technically
is that.
speaking, Dark Souls counts.
Yeah, Dark Souls, I think, like, is less of a horror game, more of a game that uses horror themes. I would say potentially my favorite game in existence is Darkest Dungeon, which is just barely
Yeah, that's horror.
a horror game.
That's horror.
Because it uses horror mechanics. Like, it's a very horror setting. It's like Eldritch-y, Cthulhu-y kind of a setting, and you're in this like old abandoned mansion, and you have like a D&D-esque party that plays through the setting to like discover the history of why there's spooky spooks in the mansion.
Hang on, can I jump in here? I've thought of a horror thing that I
One.
have enjoyed.
A.
One, simply
Singular.
one.
Non-plural.
Non-plural. My best friend and I sometimes play The Quiet Year to do like world building stuff and just fun, and it's a map building like tabletop game where you just have certain questions, and a lot of them are like, in this year of peace, and it's framed that like something bad happened and now there's, you know, a year of peace before something else bad happens. You are posed questions that you take from a deck of cards that are like, oh, if you draw this card, ask this question. And we often come up with horror themed like stuff. Like at one point we were like,
so you want to be the horror writer, not the horror player.
yeah,
I see.
that's fine. Me posing the question of wouldn't it be scary if is a way that I can contribute to this, but actually
But what if you played
experiencing
That's actually one of the best things about developing really good horror, though. Like,
Yeah.
fun fact about the developers of the original Resident Evil series, like, there were certain people, I can't think of their names, that were handpicked because they had never done horror games before because they were totally terrified. But those people understand the feeling of fear and
Yeah.
horror so poignantly that, like,
Yeah.
they can implement it well.
Yeah, well, that's
So-
the other thing. I was actually having a conversation with one of my friends about this. Just like, I don't enjoy horror, because they were like, "Hey, do you want to watch this with me?" And I was like, "Absolutely not." You know, and then having a larger conversation, being like, "I think I would be a good horror writer because I know what it feels like to be scared, and I don't like it, and I know specifically what freaks me out."
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. Like,
Right.
the understanding of that tension and that impact on your player experience is so meaningful, because there you can tell when you play through a game like Dead Space 3 that isn't terrifying at all, because it's effectively just like a shooter that you're walking through. Your like character is immensely overpowered. You're not scared. Like, my perspective and my opinion on that is it's made by people who don't really understand what that fear and horror feeling feels like, or that just wasn't a major motive for them in developing the game.
Sure.
Right.
Spoiler, in this case, it's
Yeah.
the second one.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean,
yeah.
sort of not a spoiler, just about the game. Yeah.
So let's jump in to the first major section of this episode then. And that is, okay, so we've now said, here's some horror games we like. Here's why we could be good at horror, why we could be bad at horror. Well, okay, how do you screw up making a horror game? Now, as we said, the first piece of advice is we have a section later about here's how to make a good one, and don't do those things. But importantly, there are things you can do that actively ruin the sense of horror. So, Taya, as a preliminary question for this, what is required for that sense of horror to be effective?
Again, I think horror is one of those things, like I was making the joke about the curtain, but it genuinely is incredibly delicate in your immersion, right? Like, if your player doesn't feel present in the game, if they don't feel present in the world that they're existing in, and if things happen in your gameplay that like pull you out of that immersion, you're not going to feel scared if you don't give a crap about the game you're playing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It's, I think we've chatted about this in other episodes where anything that breaks immersion, makes a game feel just sort of weird and clunky, is sort of generally bad if you're trying to tell a story to get people invested. And horror does that.
And
right?
horror is extremely sensitive to that too. It's
Yeah.
like it takes that and it almost is like a core tenet of experiencing horror, because pieces, like one of the pieces of having really good horror is that tension buildup, right?
Yeah.
And if you spend 10 minutes in buildup, you lose your player's focus.
If you spend 10 minutes because your like way of maneuvering around the space is a little bit funky, you've actually just lost them because they need to be in the right mindset to be thoughtful about it. Yeah.
So for our first point of how do you screw up horror, one of the first things I guess then would be inspiring emotions that don't fit with horror. Emotions that don't lead to fear or suspicion or paranoia, right? There's a really good example for this that we have in our notes that Taya gave me, which is frustration, right? Nothing takes away more from horror than anger, right? because like Vi, imagine this game designed to scare you. Whole point, scare you. You die, redo the same thing. You die again, redo the same thing. You die again, redo the same thing. You die again, redo the same thing.
By time 2, I imagine you are probably not scared.
Yeah. And importantly, like, let's say even if you're not redoing the same thing, you're getting frustrated. It's hard for you to progress and to do things. And this failure to do things isn't furthering the horror, it just sucks, right? This anger is not an emotion you want to have, right? I wrote another one as well here, which is boredom. I don't think there is anything worse for horror than boredom. Like frustration, you can be frustrated and scared. Like those two things shouldn't, but can coexist. Boredom is not.
Boredom and being scared, they don't work together.
Exactly. The whole point of a horror game is that feeling. Like you're trying to elicit the feeling of fear or terror.
You're trying to do the I'm walking through the woods at night and I heard some noises. Nobody walks through the woods at night bored and then hears a noise and goes, oh, that's probably fine. Like those two things don't exist in
unless
the
you
same space.
have no fear, apparently.
Like, and this comes back to the death thing. Imagine redoing the same part 5 times. By the 5th one, not scared.
And the way they're doing that too, like if you have to go back and replay something, if it's predictable, like if that gets monotonous and boring, you're not feeling the feelings. And feeling the feelings is the whole point of, in my opinion, horror games.
So what I'm hearing, very delicate system. And also, if there are places in which a character can fail or a player can fail, there also has to be an element of randomness within whatever that thing is.
Yeah. And there's one more emotion here that Vi, I don't know if you'll think about this one right away as one that could be a genuine problem in this, and that's the feeling of empowerment.
As something that you want, or
you
do you want a player to feel powerless?
You want a player to be powerless. Yeah. So a player feeling empowered is going to fundamentally break the horror. Right. Unless your goal is to now break the empowerment after.
Yes, I can imagine a very good arc of feeling very powerless and then feeling a little bit powerful and then feeling, let's do this as a graph, right? You feel -4, right? Powerless. And then you get to feel 2 powerful and then you feel -10 powerless. You're going to feel
take it
that
away,
difference.
break that power from you.
Yeah, like it can be an interesting dynamic if you're being intentional about how you're giving your player power.
Yeah.
But if you're just like, I want my player to be God, then you're not going to be scared of the monsters.
There's difference between a momentary feeling of safety and just we wanted the player to feel safe, and that's not the point.
Yeah. The momentary safety enhances the loss of safety later. But if you don't have that, it's not meaningful.
This is Shakespeare having comedic monologues in tragedies because you need to have something funny to understand how sad something is.
Fair.
Yeah. I think a really good example of empowering your player and it breaking the horror is Doom as a game series. I think everyone here knows the Doom games, big power fantasy style games. Those are the scene, the character design, the world you're in. All of this is horror, but they're scared of you.
Yeah.
You are the final boss of the horror game. So Doom isn't a horror game, despite the fact it uses all of the tropes we know from horror, because the whole point is this is empowerment.
Yeah,
right?
it's a reframing of how you understand a horror game.
Yeah, and that's fine. Doom is not a horror game. But one that did fail, Dead Space 3.
And also the
game it copied. Resident Evil 4, in my opinion.
Identically, but and that was intentional. But Dead Space is actually a really good example too, because I think Dead Space 1 does horror quite well in that aspect, because it disempowers your player. You're fighting these alien monsters in space. So for one thing, you're in space, you're isolated, and that's a freaky atmosphere that works well for you.
Yeah,
and then these
personally one I don't enjoy.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly. So it's working well because it's making you feel scared, right? But the monsters compared to your player feel insanely impossible to fight. You don't know where they are. They're really fast. They're coming after you. The beginning of the game, you're shot into this mystery space station and then cut off from your teammates, and then you're immediately chased by these spooky alien things.
Yeah.
So you feel like you have no shot against them. And then in Dead Space 3, you get big fancy guns and you can just suplex the aliens.
Yeah.
So they don't have that same impact.
Yeah, there are episodes of Doctor Who that do this, which I have enjoyed. There are horrific episodes of Doctor Who, which are some of my favorites, but they're also they're framed in such a way of this is a Doctor Who episode, though we know it's all going to be okay by the end, and horror doesn't have that.
Yeah, and it actually highlights kind of the issue with that power dynamic too, right? Because in Doctor Who, I think you can ingest the horror without being too freaked out because you know the doctor is OP.
Yeah,
right?
You know he's just going to be like, I know how to fix this,
Right?
even if the outcome is deeply sad.
Even when you're spooked, you're like, the doctor will figure it out. Like, he's the doctor.
Yeah.
But you don't want to do that in a game. You want the opposite of that because you want the player to feel freaked, not secure.
Yeah.
Right.
I think like one of the best episodes of, I'm going to take a little tangent here, but one of the best episodes of Doctor Who that like everybody who I know like grew up watching the show, they're always like the Weeping Angels episode.
Yeah.
The first one, because like the Doctor is fully removed from the narrative already, and there is a question of like, well, we know he's going to do more stuff because when I tune in next week, he's going to be somewhere else, but like the characters that you actually follow right through that episode, because the Doctor's sort of been removed and he's sort of stuck in the past, right? The characters you actually follow, you don't know them. They very well could die. So it is a very like very good horror episode.
It implements that tension of like the unknown and the inability to be
yeah.
powerful.
Yes,
Right?
no power and also no understanding as another way of not being powerful, right? There's a not knowing, right?
Yeah, which is an important piece.
You can be powerless and know exactly what you're up against. Scary. You can also be powerless and not really know what you're up against. Also very scary.
Both very scary, but if you have both powerless and you don't know what you're up against, mega scary.
Mega scary. Yeah, the opposite being, of course, you're powerful and you know everything, and it's like, well,
Dead Space 3.
Yeah. I
Or
guess.
Doom, I guess, yeah.
Or Doom.
Yeah, dude.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's everything's
So-
gonna be fine.
Yeah.
Leaning into the next point now, another thing is, let's talk about boredom for a second again. A big problem with a lot of horror games that we've seen, especially indie horror games or very like low budget horror games, can be tropes or the reusing of the same assets or generally being predictable. This is a huge problem because this fundamentally is going to break your immersion. There we go. If you know what's going to happen next and then it happens, you're like, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Right? I knew that was coming.
And a lot
right?
of people complain about the replayability of a lot of like fundamental OG horror games too, because
But, like, do they have to be-
developed the tropes, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's a good question, guys. Sort of that you half made there.
Yeah.
But
Do they have to be
Do they
replayable?
need to be replayable? Because I honestly
Yeah.
think that like
It's okay if they can't.
It's okay if they aren't. Like the whole point of a jump scare is that you're scared in the moment because you were already feeling afraid. If you weren't feeling afraid and then you see the jump scare again,
Yeah.
Yeah,
You know
and
it's
if you
coming.
do an original concept well enough that it's impactful enough that it becomes a trope in horror, like
Yeah.
that's an accomplishment. Like as painful as it is for me to say, like Five Nights at Freddy's did this really well.
Yeah,
right?
especially the first game.
Like, specifically the first game, because that's when they implemented a new system, right? Like it developed a trope, but before it was a trope, it freaked you out.
you're
because
gonna have
of
to give me some context here. I have
Okay,
no idea what
yeah.
you're talking about.
So
Yeah.
Five Nights at Freddy's, the way the game is set up is like you're in a pizzeria and you're in
Mm-hmm.
like a control room. You're hired as an employee and you're like the night guard.
Sure.
And you get basically like you have a limited amount of power to play through with the night, and then you have like a control computer that will use power. So you can look at different cameras in the pizzeria that has like 10 different rooms, and you have doors on either side. You can't move your character. You're like fixed in a chair, and you can open and close doors. You can turn on lights, and you can open the camera to look at where these animatronics are within the pizzeria. But all of those things use power. So you can only do them a certain amount, and then when you run out of power, you have no control there. And so like as you play through the game, you're looking on the camera and the animatronics will move towards the control room with the intent to kill you.
Okay.
So if you kind of need to like micromanage like watching the cameras to see like they're getting close, I have to shut the door. And then I have to make the decision to open the door after some amount of time, because if I keep it shut the whole time, I'm going to run out of power and then
Yeah.
I'm stuck.
Oh, so
Right.
your power is connected to your level of directly connected to your level of
Yeah.
safety.
Exactly.
Once the power runs
right.
out, all the doors open, the lights shut off. You have no cameras, and then you die pretty much instantly.
Right, and keeping
Yeah.
the door closed also drains your power.
It drains the power, so you can't keep it closed the whole time. And if you run out of power, it will just open on its own, and then
Oh, cool.
you
So
have to wait it out.
You simply can't just close the door and be like, "It's
yeah,
fine."
right.
Yeah,
And like that
okay.
is like a really unique, original mechanic for
Mm-hmm.
like experiencing a horror game, and that's
Yeah.
why it was like so impactful. I think for so many people created this crazy series.
Yeah,
right.
I think part of it has to be that because you, like, we've talked about like control and knowing and how powerful you
Yeah.
are. You've put the player in literally like in control, except that there's elements that they have to manage.
Yeah. And in a sense, you have no control because you can't move and you can't leave. So you have
Yeah.
like a limited system
Yeah.
of control that's even further limited by the power.
Resource management, but make it terror.
Yeah, it's like Stardew Valley if it was horrifying, like, at a fundamental
Wild
level.
sentence.
Great.
But there are other games that like have defined tropes or have reused tropes to the point that the horror isn't there. I think a lot of Slenderman. When I think of that, Slenderman took the world by storm by being a creepypasta that people genuinely found scary. But very seriously, there's not much horror in that game after the first 5 minutes because it's, oh, creepy guy will teleport randomly and appear in front of you sometimes. You should walk away. Right? But he will approach you more and more the more you progress in the game, which is scary, don't get me wrong. But it's still the same thing.
It's the issue of repetition there too. It's the same reason why like Five Nights at Freddy's 2 kind of sucks because it's just the same game again, and as you get more familiar with the mechanic as a concept, like it feels less empowering because you're getting more information, right?
Yeah. And there is a third point here, which is, I think, Vi, you're going to really like this one because we've talked about this a lot, which is you need to make a good game first.
Oh, I love when this is the answer.
Right? Yeah. But importantly, you can screw up horror because the rest of the game isn't fun or isn't well made or isn't thought out, right? You can build a creepy environment, but if your environment is meant for like space horror, but the enemies are zombies, that disconnect is not going to be effective. It breaks immersion. Like, again, it breaks immersion. Horror needs immersion.
Hey, so I have a little thing that I call a degree in theater. There is the suspension of disbelief, huge in everything, any piece of media. If you do anything that, like, because the suspension of disbelief is just literally what it says in the tin. Somebody, your audience, suspending their capacity to disbelieve what you're trying to say, right? So just understanding that, like, hey, I'm interacting with a piece of media. I'm in the audience. I will just, take the fact that I know it's fake and put it in a little box over there. But anything that makes me remember that this is a fake thing that I'm seeing, like, challenges any story you're trying to tell.
Yeah.
And that's huge in horror, right?
This is especially why bugs in horror games are a massive problem.
Yeah.
Like this was with Amnesia, this was an issue with a lot of mods because the thing about Amnesia is as a horror game, it's you're in a mansion trying to get out, collecting items, being hunted by a monster you can't fight back, but this monster does attack you, like straight up will just hone in on you, right? So it's a lot harder to avoid than something like Slenderman where they teleport.
Yeah.
Right? But the reason why it got so popular, beyond PewDiePie, is the fact that it had mods. Right? People made their own fan variations of the game, and you could play those. The issue is, whenever someone didn't understand how to suspend disbelief or build this immersion, or they had a bug, like you could clip through the floor, suddenly that's hilarious. And now you're laughing, which is not an emotion you should have when playing horror.
Yeah.
Right? It's very fun when it happens, and sure, it's a good time, but like, let's be real here.
If you were trying to make a game that was scary, and you actively make it funny instead, you've made a mistake.
You've made a funny game.
You've made a funny game. You haven't made
Not
a
on
horror
purpose.
game.
They're laughing at you. They're not laughing with you.
Yeah.
Right? And so, like we've said with everything, like we said with openness, like we said with pretty much everything we've talked about this season, you want a good horror game, you need a good game.
Yeah.
Fundamentally.
Before you worry about how to make it scarier, just make sure it's good first.
Right.
Is it playable? Does it work? Does it make sense?
This doesn't mean build a game, put the horror on top, because that's another really easy way to fail is not thinking about your horror through game design. This is true for most game design decisions. Think about them from the beginning. But
again, whiteboard in the room, right? Okay,
Yeah.
what are we making? A horror game.
From
right?
the get-go.
Yeah.
From the
intentional.
get-go.
good horror
Everything we're adding to this board needs to be in service to a good horror game.
yeah.
Yeah.
But you still need a good game.
Yes.
Don't sacrifice
Those three
game
words,
design for
not
horror.
necessarily in that order. It must be good and it must be good horror. It must be good and horror, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
GG.
GG.
Huh?
Good game. Make
Good
a good game.
Make good game.
GHG, good horror game.
Good horror game.
Right.
MGG, make good game.
But it's the
Make
same
good
as when
game.
we're talking about hard games, right? You want a good hard game, it has to be a good game.
Yeah.
Not just a good hard game or not
Yep.
just a hard game. Like, good game.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of helps us lead into, okay, we want to make a good game.
What's a good horror game?
What's a
beyond
good horror
bugs.
game?
Yeah, beyond the bugs and beyond like generalized mechanics and beyond like, oh yeah, whiteboard in the room. Okay. So what goes on that whiteboard? Like, what makes a good horror game? Actually, I think framing it in the whiteboard is actually useful.
Yeah.
What do you put on that whiteboard?
Yeah.
And what I have in my notes here is good horror follows a few key themes. These are all me grabbing the headers out of Taya's notes and elaborating on them. So first of all, lack of control and disempowerment. Fundamentally, these are two different concepts. Lack of control is your inability to affect the narrative, and disempowerment is your inability to affect the mechanics, right? Being hunted by something you can't fight is disempowering. You have no choice but to run, right? But also, people dying in the story and you have no way of stopping it is a lack of control, right? But other really good themes are making someone question their reasoning, right? Make them paranoid, make them second guess themselves. Another one is a sense of discomfort and lack of safety, which Taya had mentioned earlier. But yeah, don't let your players feel safe. Don't let them feel comfortable.
Don't let them laugh.
Don't let them laugh.
Yeah. Or if you're going to let them laugh, make sure it's in service to the rest of it.
Yeah, do the thing that Vi mentioned where you give them a little bit of safety and then it
Yeah.
falls off a cliff immediately after.
Hey, if you're doing the Scottish play on stage, don't cut the guard scene. He's funny and drunk. Let him be funny and drunk so when we find out about other stuff, it's really sad.
I think we need more like comedic Shakespeare in our horror games in general. I like this a lot as a concept.
You want specifically comedic Shakespeare?
I do.
Okay, so any horror game, the comedic moment is just Shakespeare monologue.
This is incredibly personal, but this is on my whiteboard.
We all have our own individual whiteboards. There is a main one, though.
Yeah. A few other notes, though, is you generally want your game to be driven by emotion. So we did talk about earlier that we don't want non-horror emotions, but we still want emotion-driven gameplay.
Part of the immersion.
Yeah. Once people start logicking out how to best play your game, they're not immersed. They're not thinking, and they're not working in terms of emotion. They're thinking outside the game.
You shouldn't be min-maxing your horror game.
Which would be really Resident Evil 4.
Yeah.
But as well, yes, focus on immersion, right? It's important to remember that immersion isn't necessarily realism, but it's, as Vi said earlier, the suspension of disbelief is immersion.
So,
it's okay to not be realistic. It's important that they can suspend disbelief.
As long as you understand. Let's go back to acting, I guess, for a minute here.
Weird parallels, but it's working.
Parallels. I guess it makes sense, though. There is an idea, which is that as a character in a situation, in a play, you should always be acting truthfully under your imaginary circumstances. So as weird as a circumstance might be, you still have to act as truthfully as you can, right? If something scares you, right, maybe, like, is it that your character goes and figures out what just made that noise? It's also something that I've been thinking about recently, which is just, like, genre savvy, right? If you frame a story as, like, oh, actually, this isn't a horror game. This is a sci-fi game. And then you inject, like, you know, the story of a horror movie or horror game into it, but you don't tell your character that, they're going to make every mistake on the book, you know, for horror things,
which
right?
could be good for design if you want to encourage those mistakes,
right? Like if you set up like, okay, you guys are on a space station, we're playing a sci-fi game, and people are like, okay, I'm ready to understand that this is a sci-fi game, and a cup weirdly falls off the counter, they don't go investigate all of their closets immediately because they don't know they're playing a horror game.
Yeah, I think that hits on one of the best
pieces. Is Dead Space. This early Dead Space is really good for that.
It's a lot of games, right? It takes something that, like, you're putting your player in a place of comfort again, and then you're making them immediately uncomfortable, like by knocking the cup. Like, if they have a preconception going into a game, Doki Doki Literature Club is a really good example too, right? You're going
as well,
into a dating sim effectively. If you don't know what you're getting into with this game, you're like, I'm dating a bunch of anime girls at school in this game.
Yeah.
And then suddenly really freaky things happen, and that's so unexpected.
And I think in games, like, because, you know, we get tags, it's like, oh, I want to play a horror game. The thing is you should maybe not know exactly where the horror is going to come from.
Yeah, you should know that you're consenting to horror, and that's it.
But you shouldn't know, you know, beyond that, oh, I know when I do this thing, that thing is going to happen, because you lose that unpredictability of things that are scary.
Doki Doki was really good for that for me. I'll say one more line first and then move into atmosphere so I can talk about this. The main takeaway for a lot of these is don't break your own rules. Set up series of consistent rules. Follow the rules of your universe. Let them suspend disbelief, and then shatter everything they believe, right? Break your own rules strategically, but have rules that breaking them is strategic. So for a few...
we've talked about in D&D, like, designing magic systems.
Yeah.
This is the thing about, like, you have to have hard rules, because working within confines is what makes you creative.
Yeah.
Right? Just saying you can do anything whenever, well, it's like, well...
That's just Harry Potter.
Now it's not as fun.
Yeah, that's the problem with the Harry Potter magic system, honestly. But yeah, so there's a few main things we want to talk about for making a good horror game, and the first of these is atmosphere. And I really want to, like, this game comes up a lot in my notes, but I really want to talk about Doki Doki Literature Club, because the game is a very kind, friendly dating sim, but you see these elements of something's wrong, right? Like, one character obviously favors control. Another character obviously has a bad home life and doesn't want to talk about it. Another one is very shy, and another one is your traditional childhood friend. Who cares, right? That very standard character for that. And the thing is, things feel wrong. There's hints at them having mental health issues, hints at things not being good under the hood, hints that someone is not okay. But it's still a dating sim, and you're still writing cute little poems, right? And then at one point, you know, like, one character doesn't show up for the meeting, and someone's like, oh, they had bad mental health. And the person who tells you is the person with the control issue, which should tell you everything you need to know about the end of the game. But they're like, oh, they were having some hard time with mental health and didn't show up. And your character, like, what they want you to do is ignore it. But your character does not want to ignore it. So you go to her house. You open the door. Music shifts, house is dark, and you hear a weird, like, swinging sound, and you just stop, and you're like, I know exactly what I'm about to see.
Yeah.
And for anyone listening, I don't need to say what the next scene is. And if you've played the game, you know why I saw that image for one frame before Alt F4ing and uninstalling the game. I have not made it past that point in the game, fun fact. And you know it's coming. You know what's coming past that point.
Yeah.
And it scares you because the atmosphere shifted. You went into the horror environment from the non-horror environment, but even the non-horror environment had problems. Yeah. And this really hits on a lot of aspects of making immersive atmosphere, right? Like having the fitting music, having the right lighting, like having that things are wrong, something's off.
Yeah,
right?
Nobody tells stories about things that are fine all the time.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's no point in telling it, right? You don't learn anything. You don't develop a character. You don't solve a problem. It was just always bright and shiny. So
it's boring.
It's boring. The fact that you go from, okay, this is a little weird. I understand that it's a little weird, to engaging with something that you probably think is going to be bad, and then you get hints of it, and you can choose whether or not you're going to see the end result of it, or leave, or whatever the game mechanic tells you to do.
And this kind of comes back to Omori as well in my examples of very happy-go-lucky pastel game, but the early scene has obviously something wrong when you're in the white space. Like, yeah, there you find, like, there's creatures in there that move around. Things feel off in, like, the mental health bad but pastel way. And then you enter the pastel world and everything, again, it's weirdly happy pastel, like, almost too happy. And your character is black and white when everyone else is pastel. So you're like, okay.
Something's weird.
And then you get a scene, which I showed Taya, her and I played through this exact scene, where someone sees something and they are like, they say the name Mari, which this is fine. And then all of a sudden, dark, right? And then you're back in white space, and you get out of white space by, you know what? I actually don't need to mention this one, but harm, right? And then you wake up in your room. Music is like low, hard to hear, kind of creepy, and it's dark. It's really dark in your room. The lights are just off. It's midnight. Everything just feels wrong. And because of that previous scene of, like, they say a name and then cuts to black, you're now in white space, you get out through a form of harm, and now you're in your room in the dark, you're like, I'm not safe.
Yeah,
This isn't safe.
Something deeply wrong.
And that's, again, atmosphere. Building this atmosphere in your games.
This is, like, when you're a kid, like, if anyone grew up with, like, the unfinished basement thing of like, okay, it's weird down here because it doesn't feel like upstairs, but I did just spend an okay amount of time, you know, watching TV or whatever you were doing in that space where it was, like, kind, like, comfortable. And as soon as you have to cross the room to turn the lights off, and then leave through a space that you thought you knew that is now dark, weird. Bad, scary.
Yeah, everyone as a kid, like, running through that room because you don't
running up your stairs before the monster gets you.
It's like, obviously nothing's gonna get you. You're in the basement of your house, right? But there's a feeling,
uncertainty, right?
And if you feed into that uncertainty, you get games that are deeply scary, right? If you're like, okay, so I thought something was weird. Something is weird. What is it?
Yeah. So let's say now on your whiteboard of ideas, you've defined an appropriate environment for the type of horror you want to make. Again, for jump scare horror, you need that psychological horror background still. Like, you still need that feeling, like that impending doom feeling. You just need to make sure everything fits together to create one cohesive story. This isn't new. We did a whole episode on world building, and it's the same things that we said there. world building. Do world building and make sure everything's consistent and fits together.
Make sure you make Disneyland, but everything is dark and terrifying.
Yes.
Disneyland's so good for horror. But for our next item, and this is one I think, Taya, you might have a lot more notes for, is actively discomfort the player. So now we've built an atmosphere. And yes, the atmosphere is pretty active, but it's kind of a passive discomfort. But I think we have some notes here, Taya, on stuff like the Uncanny Valley, if you'd like to jump in on that.
Oh, there's so many different ways that you can actively discomfort the player, right? Like there's so much you could say. I think categorizing it is helpful. Like Uncanny Valley is an example of how to just make somebody feel uncomfortable, because that it is that same like I'm a kid in my basement feeling of like something, it feels within the bounds of something that feels comfortable and right, but not quite.
But not quite. Yeah.
Right.
The Uncanny Valley is I'm trying to frame this in a way that like if you didn't understand what the Uncanny Valley was, it's the feeling that like walking through like the nuclear test towns where everything's mannequins, where you're like, oh, this could be normal, and then you're like, except that it's not. There are things here that don't make sense.
It's something that's so close to normal but a little bit off, such a way that it makes you super uncomfortable.
AI art, it's like everything's almost right but not quite, and I don't like it.
You have the eighth finger and you're just like, something
doesn't make
uncomfy.
sense.
Or I think of like the optical illusions of like people's faces, where if you look at them upside down, the eyes look correct, and then you flip them and the eyes are upside down. Because your brain like compensates for that, and once you realize that, you're like, this thing that I perceived as normal is
now wrong. Yeah,
and
definitely.
That's so like discomforting, but that does that dynamic really well of like disempowerment, lack of control again, because you don't even trust your own perception.
Well, and then if you feed into this, right? If you can reframe your understanding of the space, like, okay, let's use the running through the basement after you turn the lights off, right? You know there's nothing in your basement. You've just been in your basement for a couple of hours. There's nothing here, okay? If it wanted to get you, it already would have, it's fine. If when you're going up the stairs or when you're about to reach the stairs, you actually do hear something, you're horrified, genuinely scared, right? So it really is important to do the, like, make it slightly uncomfortable before you deliver on something else.
Yeah, you almost have a level of confirmation bias there too, right? Where you're like building this setting that's like almost correct, and you're just questioning whether or not you feel comfortable. Yeah. And then as soon as you reach a level of comfort, it gives you proof that you were in fact uncomfortable.
Did you guys ever watch the Doctor Who episode with the silence?
I have never watched Doctor Who.
Oh man.
Okay.
The silence is even like the Weeping Angels are a good example of that too.
They're a great example. Yeah. So the silence, if you haven't seen whatever season of Doctor Who that is, I don't know.
I've never seen Doctor Who.
Okay,
it's Matt Smith, right?
It is Matt Smith. Yeah, there's a whole lead up to like something is wrong in this world and we can't figure out why people keep changing their minds about stuff. And then it's like there's a species of alien in a very like Weeping Angels way of like once you're not quite the Weeping Angels, but like once they are out of your sight, you forget that they were there. So people will like something will happen and then they'll wake up and they'll turn around and leave a room, and they will have something written on their arm, written by them that wasn't there before. Or like tally marks was the whole thing, where you would have to count how many, while you were looking at them, count how many there were, because as soon as you look away, you don't remember they were there.
Man, you saying tally marks is such a like throwback to being in middle school, and all of us like writing tally marks on our arms to be edgy.
My friends all did that too, and everybody was like, what are you guys doing? And we were like, you don't get to know. Like,
it's the silence.
It's the silence. Yeah, I remember just being like absolutely covered in tally marks.
Yeah.
Like, if I was in Doctor Who, I would have been in danger. Like,
major danger. But it does play on that like dynamic again of like feeling disempowered, feeling like something's kind of off. And I think it actually plays into another category a lot too, which is like using that feeling of otherness, of foreignness, like something that you just like can't even grasp.
Yeah, you can't even understand.
You freaked out, right? I think that there's a reason that like
this was like your reference frame thing, right?
Yeah, totally. Like a lot of like North American consumers enjoy a lot of like Japanese horror games, for example, because we don't have as much of a like cultural foundation, generally speaking, to like understand where a lot of these like even like you could argue tropes are coming from, because we just don't have that context.
You don't have the source material for it. Yeah.
And so when you're hit with something like that, it's like almost even freakier because you just have no way to understand it.
Yeah, actually, this is one of my favorite things about like like when you're choosing what kind of book you're going to read, this is why I always go for like a speculative fiction that is not set on Earth. Because like Earth, I have frame of reference for, I have a logical understanding for how things work. When you crack open a fresh fantasy book and you get that like, you know, they're in media res doing something and you don't know even a little bit what's going on, like that already feels better because you can just be like, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but I guess it makes sense here. You know, moving on before you can have that frame of reference like broken.
And it exploits your creativity a little bit there too. Like the enjoyment in that book sense is like, well, you don't have a baseline for the existence you're in, so you get to fill in the blanks. And if you're doing that in a horror game, it's really neat, and that almost plays off like the value of psychological horror too. Because if you can lead the player to like fill in the blanks of psychology with whatever they think the best thing is, because they're like, I don't understand this, I'm gonna
get
fill
what's
it in,
going on.
and then make them question the decisions they made to fill in those blanks. That's spooky.
I'm gonna talk about a Baldur's Gate 3 thing, and only for like plot twist things, which is related to this.
Many spoilers.
Now, many spoilers, and it's a very good plot twist. So, like, if you want to play Baldur's Gate 3 and have the good experience of plot twist, just 2 minutes, I think, ahead.
I have seen
you
this. I have not finished Act 1.
Have you finished
I was
Act
like,
1?
do I need
No.
to leave the room right
No,
now?
you guys haven't done this.
She hasn't finished the Emerald Grove.
Oh man. Okay.
We might have to hold off on this one.
Oh, there it.
No, I
No, I personally would like to not have the twist.
Yeah,
roll for
no,
me.
that's totally fair. Yeah, I guess not.
We might have to come back to this one in a
yeah,
future discussion.
well, in a future discussion.
Just because I don't want to know the twist.
Yeah, no,
beforehand.
it's really good. There is a thing. How can I hit this broadly? There's a thing the game sets up that when I saw it, I was like, that's going to be relevant later. The fact that I had to do this thing. And then later, it tells, like, there's a good little twist that happens that reframes every interaction you've had with people, and it's very good.
I think Baldur's Gate does that a lot well too. Like my first playthrough, when I entered the Emerald Grove, there's a scene where you interact with the like healing lady who has this like very suspicious conversation where you're like, she seems like she might be aggressive here, and you get the option to just like be completely honest with her or lie to her. Guess what I did? I lied to her completely the whole time, and then I was like filling in the blanks again, because that was my perception of like, okay, I don't know what's going on here, but I feel like the safest decision here is for me to lie, and then you get attacked.
The nice thing about Act 1 is the whole thing is, you know, like, I need this thing out of my head, and so who do I trust to say that to? Because you end up having the duality of like I need a healer, ideally a no questions asked, has the cure. Which you don't know. You can't go into like a healer space and be like, oh, you'll be able to cure it. So you have to choose whether or not you're going to be honest, and then you don't even know if they can help you, and you don't know what their motivations are if they find out that you're infected and they know they can't help you, or whether or not they will.
But Baldur's does set up that dynamic that can be utilized in horror really well, which is like giving this level of openness, this level of choice to the player, so they fill in the blanks, and then based on the choice you made, potentially like completely flipping the script, and again giving you that sense of disempowerment.
I do love a flip the script moment.
If I can jump in, there's a lot more items in this, and we have like 8 minutes left. So jumping in on a few other ways of actively discomforting your players, a few important things as well is utilize fear of the unknown, make your horror unpredictable,
The
not
silence,
random.
the weeping angels.
Randomness is predictable, so you have to be not random.
Not
which sounds like a wild
entirely
thing to say.
random.
As well, breaking what people already know. Games like Doki Doki Literature Club creates a safe environment and then smashes that for you through tech horror, particularly, and that's about as much as I can really say without spoiling it. But breaking the player's understanding of the world, making them question their own sanity and their own understanding is a good way of doing horror, right? Another super basic one is just hunt the player. Just hunt them down for sport.
Pressure.
Do you know what's interesting about this from a psychological point of view? Now, I may be telling tales out of school here, but my understanding about how humans hunted was we're just going to walk at them and continue to walk until they get really tired, because most creatures that you hunt, like deer, they do like short bursts and then they get really tired and have to go hang out for a little bit. If the human just keeps showing up, you do these little bursts of speed, and then you're like, oh, I have to, you know, eat or whatever and recharge and have water, and then you sprint again when you see the human, right? Doing that to people
Terrifying.
Perfect.
That's
so scary.
terrifying.
Yeah.
Another big one here is creating tension. So this is timers, stress, and pressure to perform. A really good example for this that Tay and I looked at yesterday is the pool scene in Corpse Party. In this scene, you give a haunted doll to a team member and say, stay here with the doll that we need to keep. I am going to go drain the pool. And when you make it to the room to drain, you hear something drop in the water. And there's a specific sign saying, hey, don't drain the pool with someone in it. They will turn to mush, right? And you can do it, and you will see it. Don't. I have. And what you have to do is you have to go all the way around the pool with things like trying to stop you, right? You fundamentally have to fight back against things trying to stop you from making it around. Go to the room she was in and be like, she's not there. Something jumped in the pool.
Yeah.
Oh, no. And then you have to go back, jump in the pool yourself, and go get her. And you have a 2-minute timer, and the minimum amount of time to do this is, I think, 1 minute, 15 seconds. It's like the fastest you can do it with knowing everything.
Yeah, and that actually kind of has both elements of like that level of pressure and that level of being hunted worked in as well. Like it's not you directly that's being hunted, but the like threat of hunted death effectively for the person in the pool is there. There's also
a great feeling of unknown here of like you can take the risk and just maybe it's not your friend that jumped in the pool. Maybe it's something else.
Yeah,
but
actually, you have to
know.
go check that it was them. Like you explicitly have to go to the room you left them in and see they're not there. The game won't let you in the water otherwise.
Yeah.
Another big one here is breaking your own rules. Set up rules that make the player comfortable and then break them yourself, right? You have to be careful with this one.
This is a little bit tied to reframing things.
Yeah.
But just like breaking a rule, maybe we should change that to like just changing an understanding, right? Like if you understand that the world always works this way, there is one case in which the world doesn't do that.
It's very much like you're not playing by the same rules as the player. They play by the same rules. You get to do what you want.
Yeah. This is like bosses in D&D having like legendary resistances and lair actions, right? Yeah. There is a power dynamic here, but if you don't walk in knowing that there's going to be that big of a power dynamic, you don't really know you're in danger yet.
Yeah. And we do have one major subject left in our last 3 minutes. So we've talked about actively discomforting the player, but there is one more big thing, which is limiting the player's options. We've actually talked about this a bit already. Disempowerment is a huge part of this. Make it impossible to fight back. This is a defining feature of lower budget horror because you don't have the budget to create a massively scary atmosphere. You don't have the budget to make a big expansive world, and you don't have the budget to do Alien Isolation, right? To do Dead Space, to do Resident Evil. What you can do is make it impossible to fight against an enemy that's attacking you. That's terrifying. And indie games, that's so thematically possible with suspension of disbelief that you don't need a high budget for it. Games like Mad Father, Misao, Crooked Man, and Aoni, some of my favorite old Japanese JRPG horror games, all do this.
Yeah, there's theater shows that I've seen. You can have big, like, high budget production, right? And get the same response that you do in people wearing black clothes in a stage that only has lights. Like black box theater can be as impactful or more than high production stuff.
Yeah. And with disempowerment, there's also take away the player's ability to control their environment. So disempowerment is can't fight back, you're being hunted. Control is the type of thing of you can't reasonably escape. You can't change the environment you're in. You can't exit the situation. You can't avoid the monster.
Again,
right?
It's the Five Nights at Freddy's experience of like you have limited resources. You have no way to get up and move. You have no way to stop these things other than shutting a door on occasion.
You have no backup to like. It's not like, oh, and now it's here and I get to stand up and fight. It's like, no, if it's here,
I'm dead.
I'm done.
Yeah.
But also my ability to avoid it is doors. Like I can't get up and leave. I'm limited.
You have the feeling of being hunted, but also you have no way to avoid the being hunted,
I
really.
think that's kind of fun because it's not like I can just get up and leave. It's like, no, because I have to, like they're out there trying to get to the doors. If I also introduce myself to this environment, I have no control. The best option is for me to stay here and survive the night.
It's not only the best option, but you as the player like physically can't move within the room. So you're stuck.
Yeah, I'm saying the framing of it.
Yeah, it's
that's
fantastic. Like both narratively too, for sure. And some of the best horror games ever like do that as well. Like Amnesia and Outlast are like, and PT are like some of the goats of the horror genre because your player has no power to impact like the scene they're in. Like in PT, you're just walking around like an apartment hallway, looping, and there's
walking
a big
simulator horror is big for this.
Exactly, and then there's a big spook that's just like floating behind you, literally floating behind you. The actual game model just floats behind you the entire game. That's how they designed it, and it's hunting you, and you can't do anything about it. You cannot interact with it.
Not
Yeah.
allowed.
Not allowed. Make your player not allowed.
And that
On the
covers...
whiteboard. Make player not allowed. Underline.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that covers pretty much everything for our horror. So to give like a quick summary of this, good horror games are focused on atmosphere, discomforting the player, and limiting their player's options. But it's easy to screw this up. And you screw this up when you inspire non-horror emotions, you reuse tropes, or you just fail at making a good game. And there's different types of horror, the psychological horror and the jump scare horror. We didn't even talk about how these different types of games use these horror features differently, because at the end of the day, they both have to use it to be effective. A good horror game that is good jump scare or good psychological horror is approaching the scare part differently, but still has to be a good horror game. And that covers everything. So once again, thank you so much, Taya, for coming and joining us today to talk about horror games and how to make good horror games. Thank you, Vi, for coming in today as well.
You're welcome.
And thank you all for listening to today's episode. So that's pretty much everything. I've been Gaia,
I've been Vi.
I've been Taya.
and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
And that's it for today's episode. But what if you wanted to listen to more? Well, our new episodes come out every Thursday at 9 p.m. Atlantic, and there are 3 different ways that you can listen. If you're in the Fredericton area of New Brunswick, Canada, you can listen live on CHSR 97.9 FM through any of your radio services. If you're not in this region or you prefer using the internet, you can tune in on chsrfm.ca at the same time, 9 p.m. Atlantic. As well, we release all of our episodes on a number of podcasting platforms online, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. So if you wanted to, you could go back right now and listen to Season 1, where Vi and I do a deep dive into the fundamental concepts of game design, rather than the hardware they'll be taking up this season. Anyways, thank you for listening, and have a good one.